Good morning, and welcome to the Museum of the San Ramon Valley's virtual speaker series. My name is Dan Dunn, and I'm the director of the museum. Today is the 8th presentation in this series. Past presentations have included Highway 21, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, California's first people, then and now, and last month, the trains of Niles Canyon. Our presentation today is entitled The Secret History of San Ramon. And I'll level with you. We practiced this a couple of days before today, and I think you're going to enjoy this one. This one should be fun. Our presenter, Bill Clarkson, is the former San Ramon mayor, and he knows his city. Bill has been on the school board for a dozen years. He's active in the local Rotary, and he's also a first-rate local historian. Please use the chat window at the bottom of the screen for any questions that you have. Feel free to send in the questions anytime during the presentation, and we will address them at the end. And now to our presentation. It's my great pleasure to introduce Bill Clarkson. Bill?
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. And I really want to say thank you to everybody that's taken time out of their day to watch this presentation, this opportunity to talk about one of my first loves, which is the history of the city of San Ramon. And I talk about the secret history of San Ramon and the lost history of San Ramon because much of it is unknown to us. Even those of us who've lived here I've been here 43 years, discovering a lot of really interesting things about our city. One of the reasons I think it's important to learn about your community is that you create and develop a sense of attachment and engagement with your community when you learn about it. And the more you learn about it, the more you're attached to it, engage with it, the more you love it. And the more you love your community, the more you get engaged and work for it. So I hope that you enjoy what we're going to be talking about going forward. I am going to share my screen now and start this presentation of the secret history of San Ramon. And this first photograph you see, by the way, is a picture of downtown San Ramon back in 1857-58. Those wagons belonged to Leo Norris. And that building, I hope you can see my little cursor here in the background, that building there is a Limerick Hotel. And to orientate it, is directly across the street from In-N-Out Burger and sits about where Windmill Farms is. And you're looking and coming south, all these buildings here no longer exist. We'll talk about what happened to the village of San Ramon later on in the presentation. There's 6 things I'm going to talk about today. Actually, I'll talk about a lot of stuff, but there's 6 secret things about San Ramon that I want to cover. And the first, to start the slideshow, is talking about the valley itself. And this picture you see in front of you is looking from where San Ramon Regional Hospital is today, looking across towards Crow Canyon. And if you look carefully, you'll notice there's a hump in the valley. This is about where Norris Canyon Road is, and it slightly begins heading downhill as you go north and downhill as you begin to go south. And right about Norris Canyon Road, near Crow Canyon Road, is the crest of the valley, the high point of the valley. When you stand in that part of the valley, right about here, you're 110 feet higher than the Alameda County line, south of us in Dublin, and you're 80 feet higher than downtown Danville. The point I make is, going north, you're in the San Ramon Valley. Going south, you were in the Amador Valley. So most of San Ramon sits in the Amador Valley. The reason I also bring this up is nearly 200 years ago, in this general area, I can only surmise that Jose Maria Amador, who owned Rancho San Ramon, and the Pacheco and Castro families, which owned Rancho San Ramon, Pacheco, Castro to the north, which was the Danville, San Ramon Valley. I can imagine they met as they began to define the boundary between their 2 ranchos. And they figured the Pachecos and Castros would get the valley going north, and he would get the valley going south. And as they sat there on the top of the valley floor, they looked to the west. And the reason was they're trying to find an anchor point, a boundary point, so they can anchor their boundary line on and draw a line across separating the two ranchos. And as he looked across the valley, up here in the western hills was a lone oak tree sitting there by itself. And they said, that oak tree, that's going to be our boundary oak. That's where the term boundary oak comes from. And that tree anchored the northwest corner of Amador's Rancho and separated in Crow Canyon Road, by the way. It wasn't Crow Canyon Road back then. It was just the dividing line. Later on, it became Lynch Lane and eventually became Crow Canyon Road. That is how or why Crow Canyon Road is where it is today. Here is a hand-drawn 1852 map showing Rancho San Ramon Amador's Rancho. You can see that they sat there in the valley floor looking this direction and found an oak tree up here on the top to draw their boundary line. This got added later on. And this anchored the northwest section of Amador's Rancho. This is the Tasajara Valley, of which he got up to near the top of the ridge. This is the Doherty Valley, which he later sold to James Doherty. This is a section of land that he sold to Leo Norris in 1850. It's called a league, and a league is a measure of distance that you can walk in 1 hour, roughly 2.83 miles. And so when you walk for an hour and establish a league, he got 1 square league of land from Amador, about 4,500 acres. And this was Leo Norris's property. Now, what's interesting about this map, it shows not where the boundary oak is, but it shows you here this area where it's anchored. We'll look in closer details on parts of this map. Now, this is an aerial taken in 1939 by obviously aircraft. And if you look at this, you can still see the boundary marks of Norris's old league. And they're still there. In fact, these fences still exist. This separates what's called Canyon Lakes from what's happening out here in Doherty Valley. That dividing line still exists. And you can see it comes across here, Crow Canyon Road. But it gives you a sense of where those markers were and this boundary oak that we're going to get a closer look at. In fact, here is that boundary oak. And if you look carefully, you can see a fence line here. You can see how the fence line runs along here. And of course, the creek interrupts it. And that is your boundary mark. Another close-up of the boundary oak tree, but here is a picture of today, and that oak tree is in among all of this stuff here, and so it's sort of hidden. In fact, it's right here, and you can see the old boundary line coming up this way to the oak tree. You can see this legacy line going out this way, and the oak tree is right in there. That oak tree was majestic 200 years ago. Today, it's rather forlorn. It's leaning over at about a 45-degree angle. It's probably in the last millennium of its life. It may last another 100 years or more. I hope we pay attention to it because it is San Ramon's most famous oak tree. And because of where it was planted, some bird dropping a seed or an acorn hundreds of years ago, and that tree grew up in that spot, established the markers between Danville and San Ramon. The next story I want to share with you is we have an old Stagecoach Road here in San Ramon. And most folks think Stagecoach Road? Absolutely. It would come up from the Hayward area, Castro Valley, up Crow Canyon, come across these hills where Crow Canyon Road today goes through, and crossed into San Ramon, where it dropped down to the old Thorpe property, which was a hotel back in the 1850s and 60s. And the stagecoach would stay overnight at the hotel before it headed off to who knows where, Central Valley down to San Jose, maybe go up to Martinez. Now, Crow Canyon Road today, if you look at this, engineers carved out a better part of this hill, taking the extra soil to create a soil ramp heading up. So today it's a gentle grade going over Crow Canyon Road. And next time you drive it, look at how they've carved out. In the old days, the valley floor was fairly flat until it got to the base of the hills, and wagons full of grain, stagecoaches could not make it over these hills by themselves, but this was the quickest way to get to the East Bay.
And so they put together a switchback road over these hills, and a part of that road still exists. Here's a 1939 aerial. Crow Canyon Road heads up. If you're on foot or horse, you might take the more direct route going over the hill because you wouldn't worry about how steep the hill is. But for wagons, this was the old Stagecoach Road that headed over these hills, and the hills were right here. Now, if you look carefully, today's photograph, this being Thomas Ranch subdivision, Crow Canyon going through, you can see the old Stagecoach Road still exists on the north side of Crow Canyon Road. Now, the interesting part, from my point of view at least, is this has all been dedicated open space land for the city of San Ramon, and we are working in partners with East Bay Parks to create hiking trail easements through this property. And so I'm looking forward to having those hiking trail easements incorporate access to, be able to walk on the old Stagecoach Road. The interesting part was that at least on one occasion, a famous bandit, perhaps one of the more famous, notorious bandits of early California history, is a guy named Black Bart. And he robbed the stagecoach once here at the top of Crow Canyon Road. They usually rob the stagecoaches at the top of hills because that's when they're going the slowest or the most vulnerable. And they robbed the stagecoach. He headed north up into Moraga, into the wilderness of Bollinger Canyon to get away. The reason the Black Bart was famous, by the way, is he would always write bad poetry every time he robbed a bank or a stagecoach, and then he would mail it into the local newspapers, and they would publish this bad poetry. And he eventually got caught and went to San Quentin prison. But our claim to fame is Black Bart robbed a stagecoach one day at the top of Crow Canyon Road. The other thing that I don't think anybody really in San Ramon knows is there used to be what's referred to as a low water bridge getting across San Ramon Creek. Now, this is not a picture of our low water bridge, but it's a concept of in developing countries, poor countries, especially in early American history, the cheapest way to get across a creek was to somehow pave it with rocks, stones, not often with cement, and you would simply drive across the creek with a bed of stones and rocks to keep you from sinking into the soil of the creek. It's called a low water bridge. You see them all over the world. Here's another illustration of a more sophisticated one put in. They're very inexpensive. When civilizations get the resources, they put bridges across creeks. But if you can't afford the materials or the expertise or the money for a bridge, you build these low water bridges. And that's how people got across San Ramon Creek. And the reason is, for those of you who have been to Crow Canyon Gardens or explored San Ramon Creek anywhere west of the downtown area, you know that it's a steep gorge. This creek has cut a gorge anywhere from 30 to 40 feet deep through the middle of San Ramon. And unless you've explored it, you don't really appreciate how steep and how deep this creek is. It's a beautiful place to go. And in fact, I highly recommend you go to Crow Canyon Gardens, take the pathway down to the creek. It's just a wonderful place to hang out. You wouldn't know you're in the middle of San Ramon. But if you're a person, you can probably walk across this. If you're on a horseback, it could be tough to get across this creek. A wagon, no way. And you have lots of commerce going from Martinez down to San Jose, the two old state capitals, and they had to get across this creek. Well, the place that it occurred was down near where In-N-Out Burger is here. This is San Ramon Valley Boulevard going north towards Danville. This is heading towards Dublin. This is Crow Canyon Road. As you notice, Crow Canyon Road doesn't cross the creek. It stays over here and heads towards Danville right here. This is downtown San Ramon. You really can't distinguish many of the buildings in this photograph, but the Limerick Hotel, the Thorpe House, many of the buildings and restaurants were along this stretch. The blacksmith shop, the general store, and the school were north of the creek. And right about in this section here, the land flattens out a little bit. And over the millennia, all of the elk herds and animals would cross the creek in this particular area. It's called a ford. That's why you have a place called Ox Ford. It's a place in a creek or a river that you can cross easily. And if you go along now, Old Crow Canyon Road,
near where the Center Point building is. And if you stop and look at the creek there, you'll notice it looks fairly flat. You can see the other side and you're thinking you can visualize in your mind how this is not too steep. And they put a road across this and they built a low water bridge at this section. In fact, you can see a road called Thorpe Lane that went back right to where this low water bridge was. And when I saw these maps and I wondered, why would they have a road going back to this part of the creek? So I began to explore the creek. And I came across the low water bridge. Now this gives you a context of what today's roads look like. This is also a great illustration of once the freeway came in and they built the off-ramp on Crow Canyon from Danville and they bent San Ramon Valley Boulevard up around as it does today, that construction wiped out all of the hotels, all of the restaurants, all of the houses and homes that all existed in old downtown Danville south of the creek. They were all demolished in the early 1962-63. Later on, the other old buildings to the north were demolished, but not because of the freeway. And over here is Crow Canyon Court. Up over here is Home Depot, to give you an idea of where you are. But this is interesting to see where the roads run, and Thorpe Lane still exists. If you go to this spot, there's two office buildings here, you can actually see Thorpe Lane. In fact, here's the street sign for Thorpe Lane. And here is a picture of the old Cobblestone Road crossing the creek. Now, because of development over the years, they've pushed a lot of soil and dirt back over on the creek. And the old gentle slope is now gone, at least on this side. The side from the photograph is a little more natural. In fact, here is a close-up of the Cobblestone Road. And you can see that the northern half is sort of broken off. Who knows how much longer we have that this Cobblestone Road will exist. The city of San Ramon owns the land on the north side. We're looking to someday, hopefully, it's now in the hands of the new city council, to create a very vibrant park over there with hopefully trails that you can access and go down and learn more about San Ramon's history. And in particular, the old Cobblestone Road. Now, people used to get across San Ramon Creek. The other thing that has been talked about, and I learned about this many years ago, hearing about that there was a pioneer graveyard in San Ramon back behind St. Joan of Arc Church. And I'd heard about this, but didn't know exactly where it was. And if you go down to the Dublin Pioneer Cemetery, where St. Raymond's, the old St. Raymond's Church is, there is the Catholic section, and then behind that is the Pioneer section where people are buried. What's interesting, there's two main graveyards here in the valley. We have the Alamo Danville up there in the Alamo Danville border, and then you have the Dublin Pioneer Cemetery. And what's interesting, if you look at the people who are buried at both cemeteries, you'll notice that almost everybody who lived north of Crow Canyon Road is buried up in Alamo. And almost everybody who lived south of Crow Canyon Road, they were buried in Dublin. A few exceptions, the Wiedemans who lived up in the hills to the west had an attachment to Hayward, and many of their kin are buried over in Hayward. This is Mary Norris's tombstone. It can be barely read. This is not where Mary Norris is buried. This came and was brought down here by people who discovered it when they were building homes in San Ramon. They said they found it laying next to a tree. I think there's more to that story. I don't know. This gravestone here showing Margaret Norris. She was born Margaret Nash. Her family squatted property north of Crow Canyon Road, and she married William Norris, Leo Norris's son. Because of her and her husband having a marriage dispute is the reason why there is a Bishop Ranch. And that is a whole nother story for another day to talk about how Bishop Ranch was created and the ties to Margaret Nash and William Norris. You'll notice William is not on this gravestone. William lived to an older age and in fact lived in San Francisco at an old people's house in San Francisco where he passed away in 1921. But Mary Norris is not in this graveyard in Dublin. Going back to that early 1852 hand-drawn map, here's more of a close-up. And to put it in context, here is the Boundary Oak. This is would eventually be Crow Canyon Road to a certain extent, although Crow Canyon Road then was out here on the other side of the creek. This would be San Ramon Valley Boulevard later on. And this is Leo and Norris's house right along what would become Norris Canyon Road. This is an old legacy road that I think was first used because it went to the ford across the creek where the low water bridge was. This road eventually became the main road once a bridge was built, sort of where In-N-Out Burger is. An old wooden bridge was built. It got washed out several times. Eventually, they put in a culvert and covered it with soil, and no longer do we have a bridge there. Now it's covered culvert. And this is Leo Norris's house. And right along here was the creek that ran behind his house and would sort of peter out into a muddy, muddy delta. Drove him crazy. He eventually, and we'll see this later on, dug a ditch across to get that creek into San Ramon Creek so it stopped flooding his fields right here. But unfortunately, in 1857, Mary Norris died. She was 47 years old. And at that time, there were no cemeteries up in Martinez. St. Catherine's had not been opened yet. The St. Raymond's Catholic Cemetery would not come until after 1860 when the church was built. And the Norrises, who were Catholic, he decided to bury her on a hill, actually more of a ridge that ran up along behind his house here. I've sat on this land, I've sat on this ridge. It is absolutely, especially before there were houses, before there were tall trees, had sweeping views of the whole valley, gorgeous views of Mount Diablo. I could see why Leo picked that spot to bury his wife, Mary. And he put her in that spot, and that's where she was. And it's interesting that to go to the next slide here, this piece of land right here, this little rectangle, sat undeveloped for many years until St. Joan of Arc Church bought it and built St. Joan of Arc Church here, and then sold some homes to a development. Castleton Court was in this area. And right behind St. Joan of Arc, as they had talked about, was the Pioneer Cemetery. And the photographs over the years show that this area always got farmed around, but never farmed in. And so it's pretty clear, especially when you notice that this is actually on a ridge that runs right along here behind Leo Norris's house, this being eventually Norris Canyon Road, Low Water Bridge. His son-in-law, William Lynch, owned his house over here. In fact, quick story, William Lynch also squatted the land next to the creek, north of Crow Canyon Road on both sides. I think William Lynch endeavored to build that Cobblestone Road, and I think charge a small toll for people who wanted to use it. Now, what's also interesting, if you look here, here's the old trace of the old creek that used to run along right behind Leo Norris's house. Let me go back. And then peter out into a big muddy delta, drove him crazy. And they eventually dug this creek across to get the water over here and to free up his house, but you can still see the old trace of the old creek along here. Here are the roads that exist today. And you notice that where Mary Norris's graveyard is, there was no development. Well, there's a reason for that. We're going to discover that pretty quickly. Running all along here is this green belt. In fact, there's a walking trail you can take along here all the way down from Bollinger Canyon Elementary School and Bollinger Canyon Road and Memorial Park, all the way up to Norris Canyon Drive. And the reason this road is here, the reason this green belt is here, the reason that Mary Norris got buried right here on this ridge, is not really a ridge. That's the Calaveras Fault. That is an earthquake fault that runs from Dublin all the way up through San Ramon and north, by the way. And this happens to be a place where the two plates, as they slide across each other, one has slowly risen higher than the other. It's called an escarpment. They're fairly common. If you've ever gone to San Juan Bautista and sat there at the Mission Church at San Juan Bautista, looking down that large slope across the flat plains where on the backside of the church, that's the San Andreas Fault. That Mission Church sits right on the fault. And this is an earthquake fault And that's why she was buried on this ridge. And it's also why they didn't build any homes up there, because they couldn't build on the earthquake fault. And today you can walk down. In fact, I have once a year, I give a bus tour, and we go around, we spend 4 hours looking at all these historic sites. We walk the ground, and we walk to Mary Norris's graveyard. It's one of the walks we take during the bus tour. One of the more fascinating stories, at least in my mind, are the Harlans. The Harlans were a family that came across the plains in 1846. When they left the East, California was a Mexican possession. It was a Catholic country. They were leaving to head out west to find better places to live. Along in that same wagon train, there were about 1,500 residents, U.S. citizens, who came across the plains in 1846. Along with them was also Leo Norris. He came out during that time, but also along with the same party with the Harlans was the Donner Party. And the Donner Party and the Harlans came out across, essentially the first ones to do this. They did not have clear trails. There were no real guides. In fact, the poor Donners took bad advice from a guy named Hastings, the so-called Hastings shortcut, got lost in the mountains of Utah for a while and found themselves getting to the Sierra Nevada late. The Harlans made it over before the October rains, the early October rains began to hit. But by the time the Donners got there in October, this year, you could have gotten across the mountains no problem at all. But the early rains in October and the heavy snows trapped the Donners. The Harlans came across during that time. But when the Harlans first came to California, they settled in San Francisco. And they were early settlers of San Francisco. They owned a variety of property in pre-gold rush days. In fact, if you go to Chinatown at the Lions Gate, half a block south of Lions Gate is Harlan Place, named after Joe Harlan's family. They owned property in 5 different places all along the downtown area, including at the foot of Telegraph Hill. When gold was discovered, they left, went to Colma, sold lots of supplies to the settlers, got enough money that they were able to buy property. Joel brought property in Contra Costa County, right about where Alcosta Boulevard is today. In fact, I'm going to go to that. He bought his little property right here where today there is Alcosta Boulevard. But back then, this was all Contra Costa County. There was no Alameda County. And in 1853, his brother-in-law, a guy named Smith, was hired to be a surveyor. And he had to create a county line giving most of Amador Valley and all of the Livermore Valley into newly created Alameda County. And as his brother-in-law sat here in the hills to the west, wondering where in the heck am I going to put this line, he saw his brother-in-law's house on the valley floor. And he says, that will be one of my boundary markers. And so he drew the county line right through Joel's house. Well, unfortunately, Joel Harlan began receiving tax bills from both Alameda County and Contra Costa County, which infuriated him. And he got mad, and so he disassembled his house. He bought some property north of Forest Home Farms, and he rebuilt in 1856 El Nido, the same house. That house really was first constructed around 1852 or so, so it's even older than we think. And the Harlan house is built up here. This old 1852 map, by the way, shows Jose Maria's hacienda down here in Dublin. It was destroyed in the earthquake of 1867. That was the great earthquake, by the way. The great Hayward earthquake of 1867 knocked down his hacienda. This map also shows up here in Martins Canyon that Amador had another adobe up here. Someday I'd love to explore and know if anybody knows where his old adobe might have been up here in Martins Canyon. There was Joe Harlan's place, and then Samuel Russell, who was a Mormon settler who left the religion in Utah. In fact, he got drummed out by Brigham Young in a public meeting. He came out here with one of his wives and bought this property at Forest Home Farm, 700 acres. I theorize that I know that William Russell came out in 1848-49 to pan for gold and made his money. I think he met Amador, and that's how they made their connection, because Amador made money up in Amador County, And there's a place called Forest Home Farms in Amador County, close to Amador City. I wonder if somehow there was a connection. There's like that connection. But that's why the Harlan house is now up farther away. And here's a picture of the Harlan house, probably the 1890s. It was a gorgeous house. It still is a gorgeous house from my point of view. And today, it's rather forlorn. It sits here just off of San Ramon Valley Boulevard. Almost all of the outbuildings have disappeared. The people who own this are working, endeavoring with the city to find a way to preserve the property and save this Harlan house. And I'll tell you why this house is so valuable. In 1860, there was a census done. And then it was Joel Harlan, spelled with a D, by the way, and his children. And there was George and William Weimer, William Fowler, and Lon Harlan. And the reason this house, in my mind, is so important is that the Weimers, George and William Weimer, were young boys who came across the plain. Their mother was a Harlan, sister of Joel's. When the Harlans worked up there at Sutter's Creek and also up at Colma at Sutter's Mill, the Harlans and the Weimers, who were in-laws, also worked for John Marshall. And after a heavy rains had come in January of 48, the boys are out there playing in the race along the mill as Marshall and Weimer were talking, and the boys found the gold nugget and they brought it to Marshall. Their mother, Jenny, boiled it in a lye all night. And the next morning, the gold piece was still there. If you go to the Bancroft Library in Berkeley, they still have that nugget at the Bancroft Library, and it's called the Weimer Nugget. So the discoverers of gold were these two boys who lived in that house. The other there was Bill Fowler. Bill Fowler married also another Harlan daughter. Bill was famous. He went to West Point. He came out in 1841 on the first wagon train on the Oregon Trail, went to work for Vallejo up there in the Benicia area, went back to get his family, came out west. During his coming out west, he married one of the Harlan girls. When he got out here, the Donner Party got in trouble. He went back over in the third rescue party trying to save and bring some of the Donner Party out. And the last was Lon Harlan. And Lon Harlan was the last known Native American who lived in San Ramon in 1860. One of the mysteries I love to find out is whatever happened to Lon Harlan. I've looked on the census, I've asked, but I've not been able to track down what happened to Harlan. But in one house that still exists today, a house that was built in 1852, making it one of the oldest wood structures in the entire state, housed the discoverers of gold, the earliest pioneers, those attached to the Donner Party. I think it's a house that is historic in many, many ways, and we need to find ways to preserve it. And the last secret I want to talk about in San Ramon was the lost lands and things that were in San Ramon north of Crow Canyon Road in particular. This is a picture, by the way, of young kids in the 1890s in front of San Ramon Schoolhouse that was built in 1867. It was a two-room schoolhouse. There were so many children in San Ramon, they had to build a two-room schoolhouse. School board back then, there was a school board 1860s, raised $2,000 to build that school. Here's a picture of the school taken in, I think, 1959. This is just after the school had closed already. Here's the general store. Here's the old blacksmith shop that's been there since at least the 1860s. And this now is Morgan's Masonry. Morgan's Masonry sits in this spot. In fact, right about here is where their sales office is. And what's interesting about going into Morgan's Masonry, by the way, here's a picture of the church that sat next to the old schoolhouse. If you go into Morgan's Masonry and you put your hands on their customer service counter, you'll touch this black slate. That black slate were the chalkboards from the old elementary school. When the elementary school was torn down, they saved the chalkboards, the black slate boards, and they saved and incorporated it. You can't see any writing on them, such as "I will not ride my house, I will not ride my horse through the playground" sort of stuff, but there's the old chalkboards, and you can touch them today. Here is Crow Canyon Road. And the reason I bring this up is when the school district, the San Ramon School District that existed from the 1850s and 1860s right through until 1964, the school district incorporated all the land south of this line. In fact, if you were to look closely, these subdivisions, all the backyards, and you can see this line drawn right across this property. And everything south of that line was San Ramon. If you had been around here in the 1960s and 1970s, right through until 1982, all the homes in Crow Canyon Country Club, all the homes built down here at San Ramon Post Office. They had a 94583 zip code. This was all considered San Ramon and was a part of San Ramon up until Danville Incorporated. And when Danville Incorporated, all of the lands down like this were brought into the town of Danville and lost to San Ramon. San Ramon did not incorporate until the following year and weren't able to save or incorporate those lands of theirs. I show, by the way, that the creek here, crossed by the Iron Horse Trail, there was a railroad bridge there. In fact, here's a picture of that old railroad bridge that went across that creek in San Ramon back then. A friend of mine, by the way, she talks about how she used to walk across that bridge and once fell through one of the boards and scraped her leg up pretty good. But she remembers that old bridge. That old bridge still exists. You can visit it. You can go to it. You've got to go about 90 miles north of us and a little bit to the east to Sacramento. And there is San Ramon's railroad bridge that crossed over the creek, beautifully restored right there. And now the part that frustrates me as a San Ramon resident, if you read the description of this bridge, it says it was located in Danville. Here's a picture. Down here is Costco, Fostoria, San Ramon. Here's the Iron Horse Trail. And there's three things I wanted to point out. One is up here is a tall 4-story skyscraper building. It's sort of used for office materials, office building. Down here is where the San Ramon train station was. And further north was the engine turnaround, because at one time, the tracks, which were one tracks, came to San Ramon and dead-ended at Crow Canyon Road. And they had to get the engine turned around. And this was the mechanism to turn the engines around. And I'll show it to you. Here's a picture of San Ramon's train station. We're going to revisit the sign here in a little bit, but this was the train station, identical to the one in Danville. They built 4 of those the same year, and they were all identical. Unfortunately, it was 2/3 of a mile to downtown San Ramon, and this train station never took off for passenger traffic. The station in Danville was right in downtown Danville. It thrived for passenger traffic. So by the 1920s, 1927, they tore down our train station and took it away. Here is the engine turnaround that was north of the train station. And they would put the steam locomotives on this and they would use it like a turntable, like you would see for the cable cars on Powell Street. And they would turn the engine around so they could go back down towards Martinez. Now this is not a picture of it, by the way, but they built a huge cement pad to test the moon rocket engines here in San Ramon. For those men have known it, there was a company called Aerojet. It was right around the PG&E testing plant and over there where the school district has their building facilities. And they were going to build and test the moon rockets here in San Ramon. And they built this huge cement pad to anchor these rockets to so they could test them. Because we were way out in the country. There was nobody living out here but cows and some ranchers. But by the early 1960s, maybe 63, a Texan became president of the US and they moved this to Houston. So away went our test rocket, but the big, huge pad remained there. Later on, a guy approached the county and said, well, can I build an office building on this? And he got permission. So that 4-story medical office building is built on an old rocket pad. Mr. Burrell, who owns that orchard, or did own the orchard till he passed away, over there by Marshall's and by Costco, there's a 17-acre last remaining large orchard, collected everything. He was just a hoarder. He collected tons of stuff. And one of the things he was able to collect was the railroad sign that came off the old building that was torn down in 1927. And where it had been before, how we got a hold of it, I don't know. But we were able to work with East Bay Parks, who now owns this land, to allow us to borrow it on a loan. And we had it restored and refinished. And today you can go to Forest Home Farms and see that sign that's been beautifully restored to today's, so today's people can see it and view it. Well, that brings me to the end of the secret history of San Ramon, at least the ones we have an opportunity to talk about today. I hope you enjoyed hearing about, why Crow Canyon Road is where it is, hearing about the Stagecoach Road, the mysteries of the graveyards, all these kinds of stuff. And so I'm looking forward to any questions you might have, and I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you.
Hey, Bill. Well done. And a couple comments from me first, and then we'll get to some questions. I actually really enjoyed the way you incorporated the aerial photography into the presentation. It showed to me that there's so much of San Ramon's history that's still evident if you know where to look for it.
Yes.
So Richard asked about and I think this was based around the Wood grave site. Are there any other family cemeteries? Where I come from on the East Coast, the county that I lived in was settled in the early 1700s. And there are a number of family grave sites, and a lot of the older buildings have a family cemetery attached to them. Any others that you're aware of?
I am not. I went back to do some of my own family history back in Tennessee and Virginia, and he's absolutely right. Those counties have perhaps 100 or more, several hundred family grave sites by old farmhouses, many of them abandoned, many of them in pretty forlorn conditions. Here, those who died before 1860, like Mary Norris, may have been buried near their families, but she's the only one that I know of who was buried with any sort of record, her tombstone being available, seen on the map where the graveyard was, but no, I don't know of any other. And I would love to hear from anybody who might know about any family graveyards in the area, but I don't know. Everybody seemed to have gone either north to the Alamo or south to the Dublin Pioneer.
Okay. Molly wants to know, as I did, your bus tour. How do people find out about it, and how do they get on it?
I do it once a year. It usually sells out in about 2 to 5 hours, and we get 30 people. And we just run around for 4 hours and have a lot of fun visiting all of these sites and about a dozen more. And we walk the territory. And I think they enjoy it because they get a chance to see and experience San Ramon history up close and personal. It's through the city of San Ramon. We're not sure when we can do it again because of the pandemic, but I'm sure that come this fall, we'll be doing it again. An idea I had, and I'd like to run it through your board, Dan, is to find out if we could do one of these that would be just for those folks who are members of the Historic Foundation. We can get 30 of them on a bus and have a special one for the members of the association.
Well, I think I could speak for the board. We should do that.
Oh, all right. I'm game.
Okay.
It costs $30, and 100% of that goes just to pay for the bus.
Yeah, of course. I'm getting a chime in from Judy. She's been on your tour and says it was great. So compliments and good timing from Judy on that one. Couple comments. In fact, the comments are coming in pretty hot and heavy. Everybody has really enjoyed the presentation. They want to thank you for it. Chuck Ferreira came in, and when you showed the school, I think it was the school photo, he mentions that his grandparents' home was in the lower right corner of that photo. And it's curious, how many other people are starting to recognize places they've been. We've had somebody from Silverwood that said they didn't know that the train depot was in their neck of the woods.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, anybody that wants to correct, improve, anything I talked about, I really, really welcome. Keep in mind that most of what I've talked about is to a certain extent original, i.e. stuff I've gone out and discovered and learned and tried to put together a narrative. I think most everything I've talked about is probably true, but I always want to be corrected. I always want to be able to make a more accurate presentation. So I'd love to hear from families that in any shape, way, or form that can improve the accuracy of the information.
And then Rick had a compliment for you. He loved the way you conveyed the romance, the early pioneer history of the valley, and you now have another fan of the Harlan House. His comment was, "We need to preserve the Harlan House."
Oh, it is. I'm a little biased. I think it is one of the most historic structures anywhere in California. The discoverers of gold, the rescuers of the Donner Party, the earliest pioneers that came across the plains, the last Native American that we know of that lived in San Ramon, all in the same house, all at the same time.
Well, I'm fascinated with the story of the adopted Native American. So if you find anything out more about that, I want to know. I think that's just amazingly curious to me. And also when I was at the Blackhawk Museum, we did an exhibition on the gold rush, and we borrowed the Wimmer nugget from the Bancroft. Yeah, we did.
Did you know that? Did you know the Weimers actually lived in that house?
I didn't at the time. Yeah, I wish I did. It would have certainly added to the labeled copy that we would have put on it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was fascinating. Anybody else that you can think of? Is it possible, I guess, that were more people buried at that site? I know that would be unusual for a family cemetery, but maybe not so. Any ideas of, I mean, has that thought ever crossed your mind?
I don't know, but given the nature of how nice the Margaret Norris black stone was, like it had been done recently, I wouldn't be surprised if most of the kids had been buried in the family graveyard and then the stones moved down later on. I have no evidence. I would love to hear from more people, because I hear stories about they use some of the gravestones, and when I hear stones, that means multiple gravestones, were used to place on some of the farm equipment to hold them down when they were doing some of the plowing. As an historian, I go, oh my God, they're taking a tombstone, historical tombstone, and using it for a weight on it. It drives me crazy. So I would love to hear more. I know we would all love to know more, but I imagine there may have been more there.
Okay, so, and I know we're stealing a little bit of Forest Home Farms thunder here, but we did have a question about the glass house, and can you talk about that?
Well, the glass house, built by David Glass, he came across the plains early, had his first place up in Walnut Creek. He built a place just north of of Pine Valley Road, and that's where the glass house was first built. In fact, I remember when I first came here in the 1970s, it was rather forlorn, if I can use that term again, and was out for rent. Now, the interesting part is that we could do a whole presentation just on the glass house. And the reason I share one little snippet is one of his sons went to work in Bolivia, and he was a well-educated mining engineer, and he ran Bolivian mines. And the reason he's famous is that he would have his mining camps, and he would have to take the gold down to town and bring back payroll for his miners. And he was worried about bandits there in the Bolivian hills. And so he hired two Americans who looked like they could take care of themselves. And for well into a year, these Americans worked back and forth with him, protecting his gold. They happened to have been Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The interesting part was they eventually quit, and within 6 months were dead in Bolivia. And Rollo Norris, who hired him, did not get killed like in the movie he was. He lived and survived that. So, but he hired Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And if you go to the glass house during the tour, you'll see letters written by Sundance to him.
Oh, how about that? San Ramon never have a newspaper? That was a question that came in.
Oh, I'm sure. That's a Beverly Lane question.
Okay. All right. So whoever asked that one, contact my museum, Museum of the San Ramon Valley, ask and leave us the question, and we'll make sure our curator gets back to you. Couple people, Chuck Ferreira, one of our board members, has some photos he'd like to share with you.
Oh, love it.
So, yeah, these things will generate those kinds of responses.
Dan, I've spent hours at Contra Costa Historic Association going through all of their photographs. Yes, love to see more.
Can you explain why, again, the stagecoach switchback was necessary?
The hill was too steep. Just like when you climb up Yosemite Falls, that trail goes back and forth because you can't go straight up. It's too steep to go straight up. And one of the main exports of San Ramon in the early years was grain, and they would grow. It was dry farming, which means they would plant the grain, the winter rains, they would ripen during the spring and summer, and they would harvest it, get one harvest out of it, and they would load it up and take it over the hills to San Lorenzo Creek over in San Leandro, and they would load it on ships. It would go all over the world. But to get over that hill, you had to have a more gentle road going over the top.
We had a question about Cox Grove and where that was located.
Which one? Cox
Grove?
A number of people have asked. I do not know.
Okay.
And even that's more of a Beverly question. I have some ideas, but no, I don't know.
And then a couple questions about some more of the more. I love the way he took us actually from Amador to the space age with the rocket testing site.
You noticed that?
Yeah, I did. And there's a question that relates to that. They want to know something about the more recent San Ramon history, maybe the Nike missile site, anything from the 50s or 60s that you want to throw in.
I've actually toured, and I was allowed to go through that abandoned Nike missile site, which is 3 stories into the ground. And the whole time I walked it, I'm thinking, I just wonder what kind of mold and stuff is all around here. But it is still there. A lot of the old machinery and stuff is still there. You can see a actual functioning one over by the lighthouse, Point Bonita Lighthouse in Marin County. All the missiles and all of the engines are gone from the one in San Ramon, but it's still there. But you can walk to the top of Rocky Ridge, and up there is a lot of antenna stuff, and that's where the antenna system for the Nike missile base was located back then. Great views, by the way.
Yeah. Any idea of where the first church was built, and then do they have birth and death records that are accessible?
That again would be a good question for the Contra Costa County, because keep in mind in '53 they divided San Ramon in half. San Ramon used to be really big. In fact, at one time, Rancho San Ramon went from Walnut Creek all the way down to Pleasanton, highway where Highway 580 is. And over the years, it's been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And when they cut the county in half, half of Rancho San Ramon disappeared into Alameda County.
Okay.
So a lot of these records may be either Alameda. The first church in San Ramon, I don't know. There may have been the church just north of the school. It was built in maybe the 1880s. And it was torn down in the 19-teens. But I don't know of any other church earlier in San Ramon.
Okay, and here's a comment from Kim that I thought we'd share. One of Davis Glass' sons was the county clerk for Contra Costa. And so the old records from the 1890s are in his handwriting, which I think is kind of interesting.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, trust me, I could talk a lot of stories. I mean, Samuel Russell, who owned Forest Home Farms, that's a program by itself.
Yeah.
All the things.
We're obviously going to have to get you back. So you and I will have to keep talking, I guess, huh? But at this point, I wanted to thank you we have a lot of people that want to know how they can see this program again, and I'll talk about that in about 20 seconds. But, I wanted to thank you for your presentation.
My pleasure.
I sort of watered the field ahead of time by telling everybody this was going to be fun, and it was fun for me. And if our comments or anything that we can put some faith in. There was a lot of people really enjoyed the heck out of this. So thank you, Bill, and thank you for your presentation this morning. And now we can get to answer that question. If you missed any of our earlier programs, you can find them by visiting the museum's website at museumsrv.org. Today's program will be on that site early next week. Our next program will be on Thursday, February the 18th at 11:30. The Temple of Vesta is located in Tivoli, Italy, and marks the spot where the many waters that fed Rome converge. Okay, what does that have to do with us? Well, the Sunol Water Temple was designed by Wallace Polk based on the Temple of Vesta. It was constructed in 1910, and it's where 3 water sources converge on the way to San Francisco. Carla Schultes, Watershed and Environmental Improvement Program Manager for San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, will tell us how the Sunol Water Temple got there and about its future. If you like these programs and want them to continue, we ask that you make a donation to the museum's homepage, museumsrv.org, and click on the Donate Now button. The museum is also in need of volunteers. If you can give us some time, please contact the museum. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Again, thank you to Bill. Stay safe, and thanks for watching.